Hello and welcome back to the Nasty Metal Production YouTube, and welcome to another album of the week. This is episode number 127, and today's pick goes to Assault and Battery, the second album from, of course, the Australian cult rock and roll legends Rose Tattoo. So, this of course follows their self-titled debut album from 1978. Which was, of course, produced by, of course, the legendary late team of Harry Vanda and George Young, of course, being released on, of course, Albert's and, Albert's, and, of course, Australia. Again, the home for, of course, the legendary AC/DC, The Angels, and so on, but Rose Tattoo definitely were, actually, that kind of going a little bit on how Rose Tattoo even got to even be at least be somewhat seen by Vanda and Young, and of course being signed to Albert's production. Apparently, it was all from at least a recommendation of AC/DC after at least playing a show with them. Of course, Phil Rudd was originally in a band actually with at least singer Angry Anderson in a band called Buster Brown, and they had released at least one album. So there's another sort of a connection between AC/DC and Rose Tattoo, but there's at least a little backstory there. So that's kind of how at least the whole the teaming between Rose Tattoo and Albert Production, and of course Harry Vanda and George Young just all came together there. Of course, by the time I think when at least this their self-titled debut album pretty much had been released. By then, AC/DC would then kind of part from working with Harry Vanda and George Young, and of course would go on to work with, well, Mutt Lange, and of course from there on, Harry Vanda and George Young, obviously working on their debut album, began the relationship on basically Vanda and Young taking over, and this time focusing more on working with Rose Tattoo. And so that basically at least bleeds in to, of course, this album right here, Assault and Battery. However, I do need to bring up another sort of interesting fact here before I really move into at least Assault and Battery, is that prior to, of course, recording Assault and Battery, they were at least booked into at least whatever the same studio at least Harry Vanda and George Young at least would have their guys record at, I think, if I am though I could be mistaken. Though just to kind of continue here, they were booked into a studio in at least 1980 to actually record an album, at least an album basically, and that was going to be called Scarred for Life. However, that album at least ended up getting shelved for at least a really long time, and to this day, it's still. There's only at least one or two songs that at least has seen the light of day. That being, of course, All Hell Broke Loose, I think is actually what it's titled, which ended up becoming a bonus track on a lot of the later CD editions of Assault and Battery, and of course their cover of Street Fightin' Man from the Rolling Stones. Those are at least the two songs that have been officially released. Whereas the rest of the album has not really been officially released. It has been at least unofficially been released, but is obviously in not very good quality. So it's who knows whenever they will ever see the light of day. So technically, Assault and Battery would almost be seen here as the third full-length album if the original version of Scarred for Life had been released. Eventually, that title would be used again for, of course, the follow-up to Assault and Battery. So let's definitely just move in right into, of course, Assault and Battery here. Again, it comes off the heels of their first album, which to kind of also go back to bring up, just since I like to always bring up the facts of at least Billboard charting, basically. So on Wikipedia here, since I'm basing some of this stuff off of here too, is that when it was released from at least 1978 to 79, it at least stayed on the Australian Music Report charts at the 40th position, based at the number 40 position. So it did well. It was still a pretty, I guess you can say maybe alright album for them. Of course, I think that kind of changed over time, but still, just always to bring up that fact. So let's definitely just go right into, of course, Assault and Battery here, which, of course, obviously, who knows when this was recorded? It had at least been recorded at least sometime within late 1980 or early 1981, at least, maybe. Of course, at the Albert Studios in Sydney, Australia. Again, with the production team, of course, Harry Vanna and George Young. And of course, it ends up getting released on September of 1981. Since we're in the beginning of September, just seems fitting to also kind of just really showcase or just focus on this album and just really put a spotlight on it on here on the channel. So, without further ado, let's get into, of course, the actual album here. Let's finally, without just bullshitting around, let's get into it. So, for Assault and Battery, for this album, we have at least about 10 songs here, and it all clocks in at 37 minutes and 57 seconds. So, these 10 songs are Out of This Place, All the Lessons, Let It Go, the title track, Magnum Made, Rock and Roll is King, Mental Madness, Chinese Dunkirk, Sidewalk Sally, and then finally ending with Suicide City. And so there's your 10 songs. So compared to the first album, which was definitely pretty much as you can get when it comes to a great rock and roll debut album. I mean, to try and compare AC/DC to, or at least Rose Tattoo to AC/DC, I think would almost be impossible because they've got a similar style and attitude, but the overall attack of their overall songwriting is just completely different because Rose Tattoo are a lot more meaner and more aggressive in many ways, and just a lot more abrasive compared to AC/DC, who were all really at times were shock and awe, whereas Rose Tattoo are like a visceral grenade, basically, that it just explodes right in front of your face. That's basically the best way I can describe Rose Tattoo, like a Molotov cocktail, but in the visceral form. And it just comes off more so into this album compared to the first one, which again, classic debut album, but that one definitely was more straight up just great rock and roll in terms of just catchiness and hooks. This album is not so much about hooks, but it's more about just being visceral, a little more angrier, I guess, no pun intended, but it just comes off a lot more meaner in many places, and it's a lot faster, at times even heavier. The way it's just a more rabid in terms of its overall recordings, just the overall attack of the album. But again, we got plenty of those straight up, almost what you expect from at least the Australian rock scene that was signed to at least Albert Productions. Again, AC/DC. You get plenty of those kind of stuff with songs like Out of This Place, Let It Go, and of course, Rock and Roll is King, which again, very much would have been fit on the first album. Even Chinese Dunkirk at times even kind of falls within that. And the lyrics of this song is as raunchy as you probably can get, and at times maybe even trying to be kind of shocking at times too. I'm not going to go into any of its lyrical depictions or at least the overall themes, but just to give you the best description, it is a very raunchy track in its own right. Probably the most raunchiest I think you'll ever hear, at least maybe from Rose Tattoo, on at least any album, at least until maybe Pain from 2002. So then, of course, Sidewalk Sally kind of again has that AC/DC kind of straight up blues groove to it. But obviously, when you got songs like, of course, Assault and Battery being the title track, and of course, Suicide City, again, just classic, just rabid rock and rollers, but you still got a lot of even heavier fucking tracks. Again, like with with All the Lessons and Magnum Made and Mental Madness, which these songs are almost at times, you can almost put on the same sort of caliber of just energy and ferociousness of like Motorhead at times. Because of it, these are definitely some of the more leaner and meaner, more aggressive, in your face kind of songs. Basically, they almost have at times a very punk edge going on to them. It's because it's just a lot more raw and rougher, and in terms of just the overall feel, they come off more angrier. Basically, it's just heavy at times too. It's like you can see this as being the precursor to at times almost the burgeoning speed metal and thrash metal scenes, who would take this sort of overall just rabid, ferocious sort of attitude and just really make it even heavier. You can hear the sort of inspirations for at least those genres. But there's just plenty of great sort of tracks on here. Everything at least has a very catchy hook to them, though. Again, with songs like Out of This Place and Let It Go, and of course the title track and Rock and Roll is King, and Sidewalk Sally and Suicide City. Actually, Suicide City also definitely seems to be at least one of the lyrics in the song had to at least been one of the inspirations for Paradise City from Guns N' Roses. And of course, they were obviously Axl Rose and Slash were big fans of Rose Tattoo. They even covered Nice Boys off the first album, but you can tell that within the lyrics for at least the song, where I think Suicide City, where the girls are pretty, there's that part, is that lyrical part, at least line in the track, really just screams Paradise City, because they obviously kind of took that lyric and just added it to Paradise City. Of course, Suicide City, Paradise City. But again, you get the overall point. And again, a lot of the album on here, in terms of the overall attitude, even at times you could kind of hear where at least Guns N' Roses got a lot of their sleazy influences and the overall attitude, just the streetwise feel. You can get where they got the and the overall influence of them. Even to set some of the songs onto at least Use Your Illusion, at least the first, at least part one on some of the songs on that one, you can hear the influence of like Rose Tattoo on some of those songs as well, besides the ones on their first album. So, Appetite for Destruction. So you really can get a lot of just overall feel and influence and the impact that a band like Rose Tattoo had on the LA strip scene. I know, look on Wikipedia, they actually, one of the genre tags they got for the sound is pop metal, which is the last genre I would describe Rose Tattoo, especially this sound, because of none of this I can't really. But again, it influenced a lot of those, at least some of the more really straight up street level LA strip rock bands. It did, at least the ones that had at least an attitude to them, that had a snarl, that didn't really sound like overproduced, basically overproduced bullshit, but at least had a little bit of grit to their sound. You can hear that a band like Rose Tattoo definitely influenced those kind of bands as well, at least those kind of LA strip bands. But again, all of it, there's just you really can hear the impact. And again, you don't really tend to really hear Rose Tattoo at times in the stores in the same caliber as like AC/DC when it comes to talk about great bands that came out of Australia. You don't always, especially within the mainstream eye. But when you but I think mostly when you probably were to ask any sort of obviously any of the bands, like maybe even Motley Crue, for example, or Guns N' Roses or whatnot, if you brought up Rose Tattoo name, they'll obviously I think they'll definitely speak fondly of them. It'll be like, oh shit, yeah, Rose Tattoo. They'll definitely have a fondness for them, and they'll definitely speak very highly of Rose Tattoo, because it's a band this band doesn't get a whole lot of appreciation when it comes to at least this sort of period, basically in the early 80s. So, just it is what it is. But again, this sound, of course, it's just compared to again the first sound, to kind of keep on track. Just a lot more heavier compared, but again, maybe just they're kind of hookless in some places, but it's more about being mean and aggressive and more just a lot more piss and vinegar within this album than compared to the first one. But that's usually the kind of the point when you're writing a second album. You're kind of trying to at least to somewhat expand on the first album, but not try and recreate it. And in this place, they didn't really try and recreate the first album. Instead, they made an album that actually has its own heart and soul, its own spirit, its own overall heartbeat, basically, and it obviously beats to its own fucking drum. but it's just a solid album from start to finish, and just favorites again. Out of this place, All the Lessons, Let It Go, the title track, Magnum Made, Sidewalk Sally, and Suicide City are definitely some of my personal favorites off this album. And Rock and Roll King kind of is no slouch too, even though it's definitely trying be in the same vein as some of the songs off the first album, most notably Rock and Roll Outlaw. But it still is a great track, and it's got a nice hook. And again, it takes that sort of almost Rolling Stones style groove, or just groove to it, but just making it a little more raunchier and rock. And it just definitely a lot more harder sounding in terms of its overall feel and tone. So there's just nothing really bad on this sound. I think it's definitely easily just as good as the first album. So there it is. Of course, after this album, they would at least... Actually, you know what? Prior to this album, they actually at least ended up being a part of the Reading Festival on August 29th of 1981, which would, of course, would feature bands like Gillan and Samson and even Trust as well. Just to really name a few, even a band called Lionheart. So those are the bands that really come to mind, because I don't have the list in front of me of at least the overall lineup card for that night at the Reading Festival in August 29th of 1981. But I know that bands like Gillan, Trust, and of course Rose Tattoo here and Samson played that show, and that was a crazy show because of Angry Anderson, who was known for being a crazy fucking guy on stage. Apparently, fucking literally banged his head onto the fucking Marshall amps, and apparently busted his nose open or something, or his head, and he was actually kind of bleeding while actually just performing and singing on stage. And there's a nice fucking visual of that online. You can see pictures of him basically with that sort of bloody face. It was even used for at least a comp, I believe, an actual Rose Tattoo compilation disc, maybe even an unofficial one. It's a very classic pic of Angry Anderson on stage, just him just with blood on his face while he's got the microphone in hand and singing. It might as well have been a wrestling match, or any of those wrestling pictures we've seen on like Pro Wrestling Magazine or something, or even any of the ones that Bill Apter would be a part of. Again, wrestling magazine, or author, or fucking historian in many ways guy. Again, you would see pictures like that where just the blood on at least the wrestler's face, and that's what Angry Anderson ended up looking like. And it was a fucking wild pic, but it just added the overall appeal and just the somewhat really dangerous feel to at least Rose Tattoo. It definitely made them seem like a band that you wouldn't want to fuck with. And obviously with the artwork for at least their album, especially this one right here, they just look like a bunch of rugged, rough fucking dudes that would beat the shit out of you if you were to ever approach them or try and pick a fight with them in a bar or a pub, obviously. And since it's Australia or UK there, just an overall part of Europe pub. So if you were to fucking try and go up to them and pick a fight with them, they'd obviously would smash the beer bottle or any of the fucking glass over the part of your head, and basically maybe even take a pool stick and maybe shove it up where the sun doesn't shine. Basically, they'll just beat the piss out of you. So that's what overall look of them. It just comes off like that, and it adds to the overall appeal and the sort of, again, the rabidness of Rose Tattoo. Just the overall just the look appeal. Just again the presence of them. It adds to that, and that's why it ended up why they come off the way that they do. And again, it adds again personality and character to these guys. So, and it all comes off onto the sound and oozes on to at least Salt and Battery. So there we go. That's about it. That's all I can pretty much can say for at least Assault and Battery from Rose Tattoo. So again, after this album was at least released around worldwide, whether it be on like Mirage Records or something in like either Canada or United States. It was released through Epic Records in France. Again, it was released on Carrare Records in the UK, and of course Albert's production in in Australia. Again, the Australian label, classic label. So it gets released there, and as far as its charting, it actually charted on at least the Australian Music Report charting from at least from 1981 to 1982. It actually charted a lot higher than their debut album. It actually charted at least the 27th position, whereas on the UK album charts, it charted obviously at number 40, the same position that their first album had charted out on the Australian Music Report. So it definitely charted a little higher in Australia. So they were obviously, their first album really ended up becoming a classic within, or just a overall favorite within the overall Australian scene, and it definitely gained them a little more, even more so, fan base and attention. And so when it always when that happens, when you release your second album, it's going to at least chart higher. So since this one I think kind of did very well for them, I think it was going to bleed into at least their third album, actually, Scarred for Life. So there we go. That's it. So, Assault and Battery, again released in September of 1981, and since it has already reached its 40th anniversary anyways, or it's going to be reaching its 40th anniversary depending on what day this really was released, in September of 1981, since we are again in 2021, 40 years since then. It's going to be reaching its 40th anniversary, so it gets to pretty much just celebrate it. You can always leave at least your overall honest thoughts in the comment section below, especially for those who at least was there when the sound was released. Even those of you who actually hadn't heard the sound at least when it was released, but you did get to hear it years after its release, even to today, at least today, if you at least were able to kind of check out the album. Again, you can leave your honest thoughts in the comment section below, whether they be positive or negative. You can leave them in the comment section below. But if you haven't listened to this album, if you've never heard of at least Rose Tattoo, but at least you might have, at least their music. But if you haven't heard of them, whether it be music-wise or even name-wise, again, if you want to check out an album by Rose Tattoo, these first two albums, at least from their self-titled album, which also got titled Rock and Roll Outlaw, in certain parts of the world, at least here in the America and so on. If you want to at least check that album, you can either check that one out or Assault and Battery. These are two good albums, I would say, in my opinion, are two good albums for any sort of beginner who wants to really kind of check out other Australian bands that were on Albert's Productions that really isn't AC/DC. Because again, sometimes, again, you want to kind of check out different ones instead of just always trying to check out the same ones. And since for how big AC/DC are, and knowing that how much the band you might feel gets shoved down your throat, and you want to try and at least give at least the Albert's Production, just the overall label, another chance, I think Rose Tattoo is at least another safe bet for you, because they weren't as big as AC/DC, but they still had at least enough influence on at least just the same as AC/DC. They all both go hand in hand, but Rose Tattoo, I think, in many ways, to the mainstream eye, didn't seem to be as influential, but to any hardcore fans who were definitely were into at least the hard rock and whatever was coming out of that movement within the early 1980s, obviously at least had heard Rose Tattoo and were influenced by them. Again, all our Guns N' Roses and so on. Again, I think that Rose Tattoo would be a good fucking bet for you. So there we go. Alright, so that's it. Hope all of you enjoyed. This is Heavy Thrash saying I am out, and I'll see you all later. Take care, everyone.